So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the 8th talks for this third season for the IGCP648 virtual seminar. So you probably know me, but I'm Luc, I'm your host. And for today's talk, we're having Dr. Sheree Armistead, a research fellow with the Geological Survey of Canada and Laurentian University. And she's presenting the origin of lead isotopes variability in the Archean. So first, it's a great pleasure for me to have Sheree today. So she's the creator and organizer of this virtual seminar series. So just want to say thank you again for creating this and making that possible. And now we got back to science, and Sheree's research explores the links between plate tectonics, supercontinent cycles, and mineral systems, and how these change through time. So she's especially interested in isotope geochemistry, using computational and statistical techniques to analyze large datasets, both temporally and spatially. And Sheree, the audience is all yours.
Great, thank you, Luke. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, so thanks, Luke, for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you for running this and last season of the virtual seminar series. I'm really glad to see it continue and that there's still lots of enthusiasm for this. So let me just try and get my laser pointer. Okay, so I probably don't have to explain too much to this audience why supercontinents and supercontinent cycles are really interesting. And we all kind of understand that they're really important for understanding a whole range of different aspects of the Earth system. So we know that they're really important for understanding the location of ancient mountain belts, for understanding Earth's climate variability through time. We know that they really impacted the evolution of life on Earth. We know that they control the global distribution of mineral deposits, and that they really had a role to play in Earth's geodynamic evolution. So some of you might have seen some talks that I gave during my PhD back when we used to have IGCP meetings in real life. And so this was really looking at this time period here. So sort of the Neoproterozoic back a little bit into the Meso and Paleoproterozoic, looking at the tectonic evolution of Madagascar and supercontinent Gondwana. And now my research really focuses on these two aspects of the supercontinent cycle, and that is understanding the global distribution of mineral deposits and how these have really been impacted by Earth's early geodynamic evolution. So my current research is really looking at secular and cyclical changes in lead isotopes, particularly from Archean mineral deposits, and how Earth's early evolution has influenced these. And a lot of what I'll be talking about today is based on VMS deposits and lead isotopes from VMS deposits. And I'll just go through a few reasons of why we look at these specifically. So you can see just here on this plot of number of deposits versus time that they really coincide with Earth's supercontinent cycles. And so why look at these deposits to understand cyclical and secular changes? Well, uniquely, they span more than 75% of Earth's history. So unlike other deposit types that only form during certain periods of Earth's history, VMS deposits really form sort of right back from 3.5 GA, where we have sort of the oldest ones we know of, right until today, where we see black smoky deposits forming on the sea floor. And another reason we look at VMS deposits is that we have both mafic and felsic end members. So a lot of studies that look at the evolution of continental crust and mantle really rely on the zircon record. And we know that this is limited mostly to felsic rocks, so this is an inherently biased record. Whereas VMS deposits, they contain both felsic and mafic rocks, so we're not limited to one rock type. As well as that, we can use VMS deposits to map ancient oceans and sutures. And this is because we know that VMS deposits form exclusively in oceanic or arc environments. So this is really important for our plate reconstructions for all time periods. And so what can we use to see the variability of VMS deposits through time? So our approach is to use lead isotopes, ideally from rocks that have been dated, because we really need these age constraints to be able to calculate things like model source mu, which I'll explain in a bit. Galena is our mineral of preference. This is so just lead and sulfur, and because it has low uranium and thorium relative to lead, what we measure, the lead isotope ratios that we measure are roughly the same as what the initial ratios were. We can also use feldspar. Can everyone see the side of the slide here? Because my webcam thing's sort of covering it.
We see everything.
Yeah, okay, good.
Nice.
Yeah, so we can also use feldspar, which is a really lead-rich mineral, and then not as good, but we can still use it. It's just sort of whole rock lead isotope data. And we're really looking at the model source mu, which we can sort of think of as like an initial isotope ratio. And I just wanted to put in this slide here because I know that geophysicists really love to use this slide, and I saw it be presented in the plate tectonics battle talk a few weeks ago about how, you know, at the present day we have geophysical data which we can see with lots of depth, and then further back in time we're limited to the surface. But as someone who works a lot with isotopes, I'd really argue that we can use isotopes to fill in a lot of this gap. We can look at sort of significant depths through different time periods. And so just a bit of a brief background on lead isotope systematics for those not super familiar with this. So the most common model that people use is the Stacey and Kramer's 1975 model. And this is basically made up of a first stage model, which is this green one here. This is roughly based on Canyon Diablo meteorite compositions. And here's just a photo of me with a big chunk of Canyon Diablo at the Canadian Museum of Nature. And then there's this second stage model that's been devised, which involves a differentiation event at 3.7 GA. And the reason for this is that a lot of the modern lead isotope data sort of plots along this second stage line. And so this model by Stacey and Kramer's 1975 was based on only 13 galenas and 26 feldspar minerals, which I've plotted on here. You can see it coincides well with this model. And then using our large database of lead isotopes, you can see again this plots really well along this line still. So our database is based on around 25,000 lead isotope analyses. Of these, we sort of filter it down to be just the least radiogenic analyses from each deposit. So there are about 7,000 of those. And yeah, I just think it's pretty remarkable that a model that was developed almost 50 years ago is still really sort of reliable for all the data that we have now. And that's sort of why we continue to use it. And then apart from the Stacey and Kramer's second stage average model that I just showed you, we can also have different growth curves depending on the uranium lead or mu ratio of a source. And some of the different geological processes that can cause a change in the uranium lead ratio, so things like metamorphism, early earth differentiation, things like fractionation of a magma, and different sedimentary processes. So this is just sort of a hypothetical example of if we have like an initial source, so say something with a mu of 9, and then that somehow gets sort of separated or fractionated into a high mu component and a low mu component. These will then sort of continue along sort of this high mu orange trajectory or this low mu green trajectory. And the important point here is that it takes a considerable amount of time once that mu has changed to really affect the lead isotope ratio. And then we look at galena minerals here that once we measure them, they really record the lead isotope signature of the source rock at the time of crystallization. And so there's been different models that have been proposed for different regions that we can use. So things, there's a model for the Abitibi region in the Superior Province. There's one for Eastern Australia for like the Cobar deposits. And then we also have different growth curves for different reservoirs. So this is sort of a popular one, Zartman and Doe 1981, the Plumbo tectonics model. So upper crust is generally anything sort of higher mu. We then have a sort of mantle signature, which is a bit lower, and then the lower crust is sort of the lowest mu reservoir that we see. And so we can look at the lead isotope data in this sort of space, so 207, 204 lead versus 206, 204, but it's really hard to see different changes or patterns in the data through time. So this is why we use what we call model source mu. And we can sort of convert it into this space, and you can see that the Stacey and Kramer's second stage line is horizontal, so we can really see how things are changing through time, and we really want to be able to compare different time periods and to see sort of variations across regions that formed over a long time period. But we really need independent age constraints for these calculations to be able to do this, which adds another limitation when we're sort of compiling data. And I just want to point out here, so one of the focuses of my research is looking at the Superior Province, and a lot of the data in here, this really low mu signature comes from Superior Province. And similar to model source mu, we can use time integrated kappas. So here we use the 208 lead, which is derived from 232 thorium, and we can sort of look at the kappa in a similar way. And again, just looking at some of the different reservoirs, this is the Zartman and Doe plumbotectonics model. So generally speaking, we expect to see more variation in model source mu today than we do in the past. And I guess this is because the Earth has sort of continued to differentiate and fractionate different sources, and there's been more time to sort of develop these discrete sources. But the lead isotope signature of these different reservoirs isn't really well constrained further back in time. Most of these are really based on modern environments, and we don't really have a lot of good constraints on especially Archean environments for lead isotopes. So here's just an example of how lead isotopes have been used to understand large-scale tectonic processes during the Neoproterozoic, so a more recent time period. So by recent, I mean anything sort of from 1000 MA to present. And so they use lead isotopes, a big data compilation from Europe, and they really picked up that the lead isotope model ages, they detect large supercontinent forming events, but are really unaffected by small crustal fragments. They also looked at the correlation of mu and kappa, and you can see the correlation here, and they interpreted this to mean that uranium and thorium are being fractionated from lead, which reflects foundering into the mantle of sulfide-rich mafic cumulates from the lower crust. But if we want to extend this further back in time, so here I plotted up our lead isotope database, looking at kappa and mu, and I just plotted this up into 500 million year intervals. And again, you can see sort of up until 1000, there's a pretty good correlation of mu and kappa. But then once we get sort of much further back in time, there's a really weak or not a correlation at all really between mu and kappa. So then what's driving this low mu in the Archean rocks we're looking at? Are there fundamental tectonic processes that are different during this time? And then similarly to the Blitcher-Toft et al. 2016 study, our sort of database looking at just model ages really does pick up these large supercontinent forming events. You can see here sort of around 2.7, 1.8, and then sort of Gondwana, Pangaea in here. And another study that looked at mu values from VMS deposits specifically through all time periods was this study by David Houston et al. 2010. And they really used a preliminary version of the database that we're using. Obviously, there's fewer data in here than what we're looking at. And they interpreted that Archean intervals, so these ones here, are really characterized by large variations in mu, particularly around 2.7 GA, around the time of Superior Province forming. And this really indicates that significant differentiation and crust formation occurred during the Hadean or Eoarchean. And then with time, the variability in mu decreases, and this might suggest that mixing and homogenization occurred between these originally different sources. And then looking specifically at the Superior Province, this study published quite a while ago now. So they really recognise that this difference in mu here that we see in Superior does indicate that these sources have to have differentiated many hundreds of millions of years prior. And Vivort et al. 1994 estimated that this must have occurred at around 4.45 GA, so a really long time before these deposits are forming. And then following a similar line of thought, but sort of the opposite, this study, Camber et al. 2003, they recognised that there are actually high mu regions in some early Archean cratons, so the North Atlantic, Slave, Zimbabwe, Yilgarn and Wyoming. And they interpreted this to be reworking of material derived from Hadean basaltic crust. And so here I plotted on our global lead isotope database, plotted onto cratons coloured by age. You can, you might not be able to see very well, but the dark brown ones are sort of the high mu, and you can see that they do occur in these really sort of old dark purple cratons. So here in Slave, Zimbabwe, up here in Pilbara. And then this sort of begs the question of, if this high mu source was sequestered into the Hadean crust, then where did the low mu component or counterpart to this go? And I really just want to make the points when we're talking about how long it takes to produce these low mu values, because this is something that I was really confused about when I first started looking at this. So I just want to quickly go through why we require it to take that much time to generate those signatures. So here I've just plotted up data from Superior, which is low mu. We really need to be able to explain sort of the lower end of this signature. So we can't work out directly what time these were sequestered, but we can sort of model different scenarios. So for a first example, this is sort of a hypothetical source that has an average composition. It gets extracted at around 3.2 GA, and it changes its mu to 2, which is really low. This is sort of the lowest sort of mu signature that we could expect to see, really. And this then would evolve to have a lead isotope signature to what we see at Superior. In a similar way, we could have a source that was sequestered at 3.5 GA. We don't need the mu now to be as low. So say a mu of 6 here, this would also project to be the signatures we see at Superior. Or another alternative, we could have something at around 3.7. It only needs to reduce the mu to around 7.5, and that would also produce what we see in Superior. But the real point here is that it needs time to evolve. So really a minimum of 500 million years to be able to produce the low mu values that we see in the Superior province and some other Archean cratons. So I've already showed you a few plots of our database, but I just sort of want to lay it all out here. So this is really over 25,000 samples from over 7,000 deposits. Of these, around 500 are VMS deposits. And a lot of the credit for this really is Bruce Eglinton, one of my colleagues at University of Saskatchewan. He really compiled a lot of this data. We've obviously been making modifications and updates during my postdoc, but most of this work was done by him. And then the key observations, which we've sort of already touched on, but we see a large variation in the Archean, and our aim is to really understand the origin, especially of this low mu component. We see less variation in the Neoproterozoic to Phanerozoic, and this progressive decrease in mu variability might indicate that there's homogenization through time with different global ore forming environments. Or is there more efficient recycling of different crust and mantle material from sort of 1000 MA to present? We also need to look at this data spatially. Sort of any geological study, we need to be looking at data in a spatial context as well as just sort of the isotopes. So this wide range of mu that we see in the Archean, does this occur on all cratons, or are there certain signatures that are unique to certain regions? So to do this, we can spatial join the data to different tectonic plates. So we've used this model from Pearson et al. 2016, which includes over 1,500 plates or terrains, really. And you can sort of see here, I've just zoomed in here, you can see there's like lots of different plates that we can sort of tie the lead isotope data to. So now looking at that data, so here I put summary values for Archean VMS and low gold deposits. So each of these points represents the median mu and median age values for each of those individual plates here. And the error bars just show the interquartile range for mu, and the horizontal ones are for age. And you can see here really the important point is that even though we observe that wide range of mu in the Archean, if we look at the sort of terrain scale, they're actually quite restricted. So there are some that, are quite wide, but if we look at these ones for Superior, the vertical error bars are really indicating that the signatures are quite unique for each terrain. So the Superior province ones here, these green ones, they're all quite low. Cutval here is quite low. Slave East, these pink ones are low, as well as Hearn here. The opposite side of that is we have Slave West, which is quite positive, and Pilbara as well, which is quite high mu. And these are on older upper crust, and you might remember these are sort of the regions where that Cain-Bird 2003 study looked at these and interpreted that they may have been derived from Hadean basaltic crust. And then the question is there a potential supercraton scale signature? So here's a figure from Liu et al. 2021, which was recently published, looking at sort of this idea of sort of supercratons versus supercontinents during the Archean at this sort of time period. And so they've got this superior supercraton here and the Sclavia supercraton here. I've just sort of tried to match up the colours here. Generally speaking, there's sort of an overall lower mu for superior and slightly higher mu for Sclavia. Again, there's probably not enough data here to say whether this is true for sure, but it's something to sort of look into. And something else that sort of adds a bit of weight to this idea is, so in the modern Earth, for example, lead isotope signatures of oceanic rocks are really different between different oceanic domains. So Luc Doucet published this paper last year and really looked at the African domain versus the Pacific domain here. And I've just replotted these as mu values because that's sort of what we're talking about today. And you can see that they're really quite different. So if this is occurring in the modern Earth today, then it's quite possible that these really large scale sort of global differences were also occurring in the Archean. And then, so how do we produce these low mu values in superior? Again, you'll remember I said it needs quite a lot of time to evolve. So the simplest explanation is that a source was sequestered 500 million years before formation. But this really contrasts with what we know from things like hafnium and neodymium. And so here is a study recently published by David Moll et al. 2021, this year. And he published a bunch of new data and as well as compiling a bunch of already existing data. And really you can see here, both in neodymium and hafnium, it's all really quite juvenile. So that doesn't really make sense with what we're seeing with the lead isotope signatures. So to try and look at this in more detail, we really need to be able to compare the lead isotope data directly with the hafnium and neodymium data. And one of the original aims of this project was to really try and collect those other isotope data like neodymium from the exact sort of samples where we have lead isotope data, but unfortunately with COVID and everything, we just haven't been able to do that. So to try and push this idea forward a bit, we've sort of used the GeoRock database, which obviously not as good as trying to get our own new data, but we can sort of look at this to see preliminarily what might be going on here. So yeah, whole rock data is not as good as the ore data, but we can still kind of use it. You can see that there's a much wider range in mu values. So the whole rock data here is the blue diamonds, but generally they're quite similar. They're all still showing that they're low mu for these whole rock samples, which is good. It means that the ore data isn't drastically different from the whole rock data. And then we've also compiled a bunch of ages for the whole the GeoRock data that had missing ages, because we need these to be able to calculate mu and kappa. And so here I've plotted up sort of all the Archean cratons. You can see there's a lot of data for superior, which are these yellow squares here. And you can see really that this low mu signature here really correlates strongly with juvenile neodymium. So we really need to understand what rocks or geological settings can produce low mu, which takes a really long time to evolve, but at the same time produce neodymium and hafnium that's juvenile and basically coming straight from the mantle, to put it really simply. So what are some potential sources? So we know that things like granulite facies metamorphism produce low mu environments, so they drive off uranium during metamorphism, which lowers the uranium lead. But these probably wouldn't maintain a juvenile hafnium neodymium signature. So this is probably not the environment we're looking for. We know that low uranium lead ratios exist in some mafic garnet peroxenite xenoliths, but the hafnium and neodymium signatures aren't really well constrained in those. So we're potentially looking for a source that has low mu, that's really lead rich with low neodymium concentrations, so that, you know, that won't affect the final source, and that mixes with a juvenile source that has low lead concentrations at around 2.7 Ga for superior province. So this next part's a bit more arm-wavy and just having sort of a real preliminary look at some potential rock types that could fit this sort of criteria. So again, here I've used the GeoRock, Archean whole rock database. And so I plotted up mu for each sort of different rock type. And just a quick caution that the mu here is calculated based on the model age, which is a little bit less reliable than using independent age constraints, but we can still use it sort of for a first pass look. We can see the rock types with mu that are significantly sort of lower than this mantle line. So we have amphibolite, schist, gabbro, basalt, anorthosites, and dacites that are all quite low. But again, as I said, we need something that has a low neodymium concentration relative to lead. So we can look at model source mu versus the lead neodymium ratio. And again, some of these rock types stay out as being sort of higher lead to neodymium ratio, so amphibolite, schists, and orthosites. But we really need to do more work on this to see if these are even feasible source materials, and the mechanisms for how they can form sort of quite early in Earth's history and then sort of maintain, sort of stay somewhere where they can then be incorporated into later deposits, and how they can mix with other material to form a composition that's low mu and also juvenile in neodymium and hafnium. So to summarise, the work we've done has really shown that some Archean cratons have really low mu values, and these are really unique to this time period. We don't see low mu values in time periods much after this. These really require a source that was sequestered at least 500 million years prior to their formation. However, this really contrasts with the available neodymium and hafnium isotope data, especially for Superior, where we actually have quite a bit of data to be able to look into this. And then so our next steps really are to try and identify potential geological settings and rock types that are feasible to produce these signatures that we see in some Archean cratons. And then before I finish, I just wanted to show you this. So if anyone works with lead isotope data, or if you're interested in working in these data, so I've developed an R package, which you can download here, and you can use this to sort of quickly calculate things like model source mu, kappa, model ages, initial ratios, and all the different plots, model curves and stuff as well. If you're not really into coding, I've also made this app, like a web app, so you can just get to that here, and you can just like copy and paste your data from a spreadsheet, and it'll automatically calculate all these values and plot it up. And yeah, if anyone's interested in using that, just you can send me an email and I can show you some more. But yeah, thank you, and there's time for some questions. Thanks.